All right then, so we've been looking at country-specific problems, but let's take a look at what lies ahead in 2024 on a continental scale. And remember, this is a year that'll have at least 14 different elections taking place somewhere across Africa. Now, it's worth pointing out that average growth in 2023, it's actually expected to decline for the second consecutive year to just 3.3%. That's about 70 basis points lower than 2022's figure. Growth next year is forecast to rise back up, at least to a baseline of around 4%. But to quote the IMF in their latest forecast, the rebound is not guaranteed.
The funding squeeze is not over, and while debt levels have stabilized, the cost of repayments has increased and high debt service ratios to revenue risk crowding out vital development spending. Inflation was still too high, with 1/3 of countries having double-digit inflation. Policymakers in the region face some of the most daunting policy challenges in the world. They must continue to maintain macroeconomic stability amid limited resources and development needs as they continue to face frequent shocks and fragility.
So to give you a bit of granularity, here's where the tentpole economies, if you will, of the regions across Africa do stand. Starting with South Africa, it might see only 1.8% of GDP growth next year, but because it accounts for almost 20% of the region's entire economic output in sub-Saharan Africa, that will help to push the region's overall growth a little bit higher. In the West, Nigeria is forecast to grow by 3.1%. It's about 20 basis points higher than 2023. In the East, Kenya's GDP growth is forecast at between 4.5% and 5.2%. And that is important because it's well under its pre-pandemic 5-year average. Add in recoveries from Angola, Ghana, Tanzania and Uganda. All of those are key to hitting that number of 4%. Nonetheless, it is still too early to call this a win. According to the IMF, debt levels have stabilized across the region at around 60% of GDP, and they expect it to start declining in 2024. But that's due to two things. The first is a bit of spending restraint by some governments, not necessarily of their own volition. But the second is higher revenues as a percentage of GDP. Now, that drive for higher taxes has triggered protests in Ghana, Kenya and several other countries as well. And it's causing concern among businesses and households who are seeing their revenues and incomes battered by inflation and currencies that have lost anywhere between 25% to 70% of their value in the last 12 months. But with debt service ratios still elevated, countries quite literally have their backs to the wall because they still need to service the debt, and they also have to cover the cost of education, healthcare, infrastructure, construction and maintenance, and so on. And that, as Abebe Selassie put it to me in June, is the challenge, not just for 2023, but for 2024.
This point that I made about this fiscal trilemma that our countries face first occurred to me in Kenya around 2016-17, when, and those were the good times, no? When economy was still growing and there was no debt issue. But I was struck by how much resistance there was in Parliament to raising revenues, even when the economy was growing and on a glide path, which seemed very reasonable. There was tremendous pushback. And the then Minister, Cabinet Secretary, was also facing tremendous pressures to continue investing in infrastructure. Okay. So that pressure was relentless. And of course, everybody in the social media and elsewhere complaining also about that country's debt level is going up. And I was struck by how much there was this lack of recognition of our own agency as Africans, as countries, as governments. Huh? I mean, and also, I felt sorry for the CS, because how is he going to survive? Huh? Nobody wants to pay taxes, nobody wants spending to be cut, and nobody wants debt to go up.
And that right there, those three issues on debt, spending and taxes, that sums up the fiscal trilemma that countries and policymakers across Africa are facing not just now, but they'll also be facing in the next 12 months in 2024. So next year may see a rebound in economic activity, but this continent is not out of the woods just yet.